Chapter 10. Happiness. There is nothing more amazing than walking into one's own dream. Her mother was real. She had come, and Annika, from the moment she felt her mother's arms round her, was in a daze of happiness. She could hardly bear to be separated from her, even by the length of a room. Annika had imagined an elegant and confident woman, but even in her wildest dreams she had not thought that her mother might be an aristocrat, a nobly born woman with a von in front of her name and a family crest. Yet it was so. Her mother's name was Eldrat von Tannenberg, and she lived in an ancient moated house in the north of Germany, which had been in her family for generations. Not only that, but she was beautiful. Tall, with thick black hair she wore in plaits round her neck, long narrow hands and feet, and a slender neck. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke, in her deep serious voice, and in an accent so different from the lilting speech of the Viennese, held Annika spellbound. Even the scent she wore was different, a dark, musky, exotic scent that smelt as though the flowers it was made from came from an unknown land. Frau von Tannenberg had of course brought papers to show that she was truly the woman who had left her baby on the altar steps in the church at Pettelsdorf. Among these was a document witnessed by one of Vienna's most famous lawyers, Herr Adolf Pulpermann Schisslinger. It was an affidavit signed by the midwife at Pettelsdorf, Amelia Plotz, swearing that she had assisted at the birth of a daughter to Frau Eldart von Tannenberg on the 6th of June 1896. There could be no doubting a document witnessed by Herr Pummelmann Schlissinger. He was a small, dapper man with a well-oiled moustache, who wore pointed shoes and purple cravats, and could be seen at the most fashionable gatherings in the city. The professors knew him well. He belonged to the same club as Professor Julius, collected silver salad servers, and was often called in by the university in their disputes with the council. "If Pumpelmann Schissinger's put his name to it, then that's the end of the matter," said Professor Julius sadly, and all hope that there had been a mistake or a misunderstanding had to be abandoned. The afternoon was spent in business matters. But as supper time drew closer, there were problems. Frau von Tannenberg obviously could not eat in the kitchen. On the other hand, if she dined with the professors, Annika could not be expected so suddenly to eat upstairs. So, most tactfully, Annika's mother invited her daughter to join her for supper at the Hotel Bristol where she was staying, so they could get to know each other quietly by themselves. "My God, the Bristol!" said Ellie, and she and Sigrid pulled themselves together and washed Annika's hair and buffed her nails and dressed her in the brown velvet dress that Sigrid had made her for Christmas. And they were only just ready when the doorbell rang, and it was Annika's mother come to fetch her in a hansom cab. The Bristol was Vienna's most luxurious and expensive hotel. Even royalty stayed there when they visited the city, and Frau von Tannenberg was pleased with it. And her new daughter was going to be a credit to her, she could see that. Watching Annika come towards her in the dining room, weaving her way between the tables with their starched damask and gleaming silver, seeing her smile at the waiter as he pulled out her chair, Frau von Tannenberg could only congratulate the cook and the housemaid who had brought her up. She had been prepared to gently initiate Annika into the art of managing the battery of knives and forks, and showing her from which glass to drink, but there was no need. In Vienna's most splendid dining room, Annika was perfectly at home. Because she was still trying to match up her daydream with what was happening, Annika asked about a dog. "Did you bring one?" she asked, a little foolishly. Annika's mother shook her head. "Are you fond of dogs?" "Yes, I am. Very. I've always wanted one, all my life." "Well, there are plenty of dogs at Spittal. Plenty of animals altogether. There's a farm attached to the house." Annika nodded. It sounded good. But of course, it did seem as though her mother was going to take her away. Well, obviously, except that in her daydream, her mother had just come and the dream had stopped. It was a dream about coming, not going. No one in her dream had gone. Annika took a deep breath. "I kept wondering why you left me." Her mother leaned forward and took both Annika's hands across the table. "Of course you wondered. Of course, my poor child. And now that I've met you, I know you'll understand. You have such a sympathetic face. I'll tell you exactly what happened. But I'm afraid you'll have to face one thing, my dearest girl. Your father was a louse." Annika was startled. She knew that the aristocracy often used strong language. It was strange to hear her father called a louse. "So good looking, you take after him. But a louse just the same." And she told Annika what had happened all those years ago, when she was a young and inexperienced girl. "I was so young. You must remember that. I was just 18 years old. I had developed a bad cough, and Spittal, my home, is very low-lying. So the doctors said I needed mountain air, and they sent me, with my maid of course, to a hotel in the Alps, near Pettelsdorf," put in Annika. Her heart was beating very fast. "Yes, on the other side of the pass." She paused and lifted one finger in the direction of the waiter, who came at once to remove their plates. "When I had been there a few weeks, my maid became ill, so I sent her back to her home. But I didn't tell my father. He was very, very strict. I'd never been alone, and I was enjoying it. But then, of course, I met a man." She gave a deep sigh and took another roll from the dish. "My father?" She nodded. "You can't believe how handsome he was. The same dark gold hair as you have, the same thoughtful eyes. He was a hussar. He wore a blue uniform with silver facings. And well, we fell in love." She paused and Annika waited. Her father, in a blue uniform like the Kaiser wore. He asked me to marry him, and I agreed. I was so happy. He said he would get the papers we needed. I knew nothing. I'd never been away from home before. We went through a wedding ceremony in a little office somewhere. I see now that he must have bribed some clerk. And then we set off on our honeymoon. A week after that, he vanished. He simply disappeared off the face of the earth. I tried to trace him through the army, but they'd never heard of him. Oh, I was desperate. I trusted him completely." She paused, put a hand to her throat, as though she was once again living through the agony. "And then," she looked away for a moment, "I found I was expecting a child. I don't know if I should speak to you so frankly, but I imagine that children brought up as you have learned things early. Yes. I was frantic. I knew my father would kill me if he found out. The disgrace and shame. The wedding was only a sham, you see. So I pretended I was still with my maid and taking a cure. I was quite alone when you were born, in a little chalet. The midwife only came at the last minute. Oh, the agony I went through, deciding what was best for you. I had found the little pilgrim church at Pettelsdorf in one of my lonely walks. I thought it was so beautiful, such a holy place. So I wrapped you up and took you there and laid you down beneath the altar. And then I went home. She was holding her handkerchief to her eyes, a lace-edged one with the von Tannenberg crest embroidered in one corner. May you never know such despair and wretchedness, my daughter. May God shield you from it. And you never found my father? You never saw him again? Never. I think he must be dead. It would be better if you thought him so. Annika was going through the story in her mind. She could imagine it all. The love, and then the anger, the sorrow, the awful decision to be made. You will want to know why I have come now, so long afterwards, to claim you, and I will tell you. You see, my father died not long ago. He was a man feared everywhere, the Freiherr von Tannenberg. But Spittal now belongs to me, and anyone who does not accept my daughter will be banished from my sight. She stretched her hands out across the table. We will start a new life, Annika, a new life in your family home. Yes, said Annika, yes. So she was going away. Of course, she would come back on visits. She was definitely going. You see, you haven't just found a mother, said Frau von Tannenberg. You have a brother too, a half-brother, all of your own. Annika was bewildered. How? When I came back home, I was so lonely, so sad, you can imagine. But then a man came to court me, a decent man and of good family, Franz von Unterfall. His people had an estate not far from ours, so I married him, and very quickly our son was born, Hermann. He's not much younger than you, and you will love him. Everybody loves Hermann. Annika was trying to take all this in. So I have a stepfather too? You have, but you won't see him for a while. He's away in America on diplomatic business, which is why I'm living in my old home. But you mustn't worry about being lonely. My sister lives very near Spittal, and she has a daughter, Gudrun. She's a dear girl, your new cousin. So, you see, you won't be short of company. Annika slept very little that night. Mostly, of course, it was because of her great happiness, but partly, too, it was because she had a stomachache. She wasn't really used to eating large meals late at night. At 2 o'clock, she got up and went to the lavatory and was sick. Usually, when she was unwell, she called Sigrid next door or went down to Ellie in her room near the kitchen. But of course, she couldn't do that now. The daughter of Eldrat von Tannenberg couldn't wake people up just because she felt ill. In fact, Sigrid was awake, and Ellie too. They heard Annika and waited for her to come to them, but she did not come. Her door clicked shut again, and they knew then that the old life was finally over. After that, everything happened very quickly. Once Professor Julius had checked out the documents that Frau von Tannenberg had brought, there was nothing to put off Annika's departure, and he called her in for a lecture on her new home. You will be living in Norland, in the northeast of Germany, not far from the Baltic Sea. The soil there is clay on a bed of granite, so the land is liable to flooding, and the main crop is sugar beet and other root vegetables. And he went on to explain the different German states and how one country, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor of Germany, who was younger and healthier than the Austrian Empire, with a bigger moustache, was trying to build up the German army and navy so as to make Germany the most important country in Europe. 2 days before Annika was due to leave, Sigrid came into the kitchen to find Ellie holding the old black book of recipes that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mothers before her. I wanted to give it to Annika on her next found day. Do you think I should give it to her now, to take away? Sigrid stood beside her friend, looking at the page Ellie held open. The instructions for cooking the Christmas carp, and the words Annika had written underneath. A pinch of nutmeg will improve the flavour of the sauce. Ellie, she's going to a different life. She's going to be a proper lady, a von. She won't get much chance to cook, I'd say. Well, if they don't encourage her, they're wicked, said Ellie fiercely. Annika's got a proper talent. If it was for music or painting, they'd see she carried on. But she stood, looking at the book a little longer, and then she put it back on the shelf. Ellie had managed to pull herself together and was determined not to spoil Annika's joy. If she cried now, she did it at night, under her pillow, and in the morning she washed her face rather longer than usual, so that Annika saw nothing wrong. Sigrid too busied herself, washing and ironing Annika's clothes, sewing on buttons, checking hair ribbons. Frau von Tannenberg was not going to buy anything for the child till they got home, she said. Spittal was not far from the spa town of Bad Haxenwald, where the most important people in Europe went to be cured of their diseases, and the shops were splendid. You can imagine how much I shall enjoy dressing my little girl, she told Sigrid. It's what every mother dreams of. Sigrid sighed, for she too would have liked to take Annika into a dress shop and fit her out without worrying about the cost, but she said nothing. Rather a lot of people were saying nothing, it seemed to Annika. The professors, the Bodeks, Pauline. It was as though they didn't understand the marvellous thing that had happened to her. Only Lomery's family seemed impressed. Her father had looked up Spittal and found that it was mentioned in the guidebooks as an interesting fortified house of 17th century. To see Lomery curtsying when she was introduced to her mother had given Annika a moment of pure pleasure. Pauline had hardly come out of the bookshop since the day Frau von Tannenberg arrived, and Annika was puzzled. She couldn't believe that her friends were jealous of her, but why couldn't they share in her happiness? Then, on the day before she was due to leave, Stefan and Pauline asked her to come to the deserted garden. The snow had melted at last, but it was still very cold. They sat inside the hut, wrapped in a blanket. Ellie had prepared a picnic, but no one felt much like eating. Both of Annika's friends had bought farewell presents. Stefan had carved her a little horse. To remind you of when we went to see the Lepanzas, he said. I won't need reminding, said Annika. Pauline had copied the best of her scrapbook collection into a special notebook that could be fastened with a ribbon. All of her favourite stories were there. The one about the girl with measles swimming the Danube, the one about the champion wrestler with the back to front foot, and a new one about a boy who was herding his mother's cow across a frozen lake when the ice broke and the cow fell into the water. He held the cow by the horns, and he just held on until help came, and his fingers were so badly frostbitten that one had to be amputated, but the cow was saved. Annika took the book and thanked her warmly. It must have taken hours and hours to copy all the stories in. I know you don't need to be made brave, because you are brave. But one never knows, said Pauline. But the real reason they brought her to the hut was to tell her that whatever happened to her in her new life, they would never forsake her. I really hate aristocrats, you know, said Pauline, always grinding the faces of the poor. My mother wouldn't grind the faces of the poor, said Annika. All the same, she knew how Pauline felt. Last spring they had acted the story of Marie Antoinette going to the guillotine. Annika had been the doomed queen, and she'd been shocked at the glee with which Pauline and Stefan had jeered at her as she bared her throat for the knife. On the other hand, it isn't your fault you've turned out to be a von Tannenberg, Pauline went on. So if you need us, just say the word. Yes, said Stefan, nodding his blonde head. Just say the word. After that, the hours rushed by, and suddenly her suitcase was packed, and it was time for the last goodbyes. She'd said goodbye to Joseph in the cafe, and his mother, to Far Anselm in the church, to the lady in the paper shop. Now she went upstairs to say goodbye to the professors, who weren't professors anymore, but uncles, and to Aunt Gertrude, who suddenly bent down to kiss her, bumping her nose. Then came Sigrid and Ellie. They had prayed and they had practiced, and now they stood, dry-eyed and side by side, to give Annika a cheerful send-off. But as Annika put her arms round Ellie, something horrible happened to her. It was as if she was being disemboweled, as though her insides were really being pulled apart. "I'm coming back," she cried. "I'm coming back often and often. My mother says I can." Why did no one listen? Why did no one understand that she was coming back? "Yes, dear, of course you're coming back," said Ellie quietly. Then the carriage was at the door. Though Annika had already taken leave of everyone, they had all gathered in the square to wave. The same people had been there just a few days ago when she and Stefan had come back from the Prater. The Bodeks with the baby, Pauline and her grandfather, Joseph from the cafe. Annika climbed into the carriage, where her mother sat waiting. As it clattered away from the cobbles, the Bodek baby in his pram began to scream. He screamed and he screamed, and he screamed long after the carriage had turned into the Kellerstrasse and was out of sight. Nobody hushed him. Instead, as he became more and more purple with sorrow and rage, they nodded their heads. "Exactly so," they said to each other. "Yes, yes, exactly so."